Noisy, real nasal.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
Noisy, nasally onboard laptop mic. Probably.
Okay, so this video is for something I was supposed to actually show in person today. I recorded some audio, loaded up my laptop, and drove to Honolulu for the first time in a couple of years, I think. And as usual, my stomach doesn't let me do useful things for other people, so I'm going to try to show it in a video. And I mean, we all go through this, right? The phone calls or Skype calls or whatever, they're just really screechy. I don't know if you ever heard, like, one of the first things I was working on when Justin made Re-X Comp was Richard Carrier and Kelly from Rational Response Squad both had these really screechy voices, and it was the perfect thing for a multi-band compressor. Usually it's like this nasal kind of thing. And I kind of exaggerate it. Let me play a little chunk of audio here.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
Okay, and so I guess maybe we should look at it. Let me
Here's a real nasal.
So you can tell it's just pretty peaky.
Mic. Here's a real nasal. This.
So, I mean, so the vMix seems to have VST plugins now, but it doesn't have. Has to be VST3, and unfortunately, most of the free ones that I really like, they're not VST3 yet. But what I would try first before anything, like if you're dealing with this in something that you can open it in, Sonic Anomalies Tri-Leveler. It's a lot like Jordan's old broadcast plugin. Let's just see what this does real quick.
Here's a real nasal.
Oops, let me enable this.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So that's not helping much.
Here's a real nasal.
It's helping with the noise some, but let's see this really noisy, kind of far away from the mic.
Noisy, nasally onboard laptop mic. Probably what people are going to be using for Skype. Noisy and nasally.
So I'm going to turn off the tri-leveler and let's see what that sounds like.
Noisy, nasally on.
So not real big improvement there. So, but normally that's what I use for. Actually, that's what I'm talking through right now. It's this tri-leveler thing. But so usually the first people think to run through is let's just say grab an equalizer, right? So let me pull up Nova here.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is.
Sorry, that's really annoying, but doesn't Nova have a spectrum analyzer? I swear it does. Oh wow, have I lost my mind here? Am I using some weird version of Nova or something? I swear there's a analyzer on this.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal.
Oh my god. Anyway, you know what? I'm just gonna pull up tone boosters for this. This one isn't free, but you can do zero latency, and you can get zero latency.
Here's a real.
You just have to hit play first. This one definitely has an analyzer. So normally you would just think, oh, let's do it with an EQ and get rid of that gross peaky frequency, right?
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off.
So you could use that peak right there and just turn it down. You know, you could make it a lot quieter. So you'll hear this. This does help with that troublesome part.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off.
So you really can kind of fix it with the EQ. But watch what happens if I play it in a part where it's actually done well.
Noisy, nasally onboard laptop mic. Probably what people are going to be.
It kind of makes the stuff fall apart. So you it seems farther away than it would. And if you're, so you don't want to, for live stuff, you're not going to want to turn it on and off and you can't automate it for sure. So let's go through these two sections right here. I'm just going to loop this.
Noisy, nasally onboard laptop mic. Screechy, noisy, real nasal.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
Screechy, noisy, real nasal.
Here's a real nasal. This is the.
So see, just using the EQ to get rid of it, it can make it hard to hear and everything else. So this is a perfect place for a dynamic equalizer or a multiband compressor. This tone boosters one actually has a dynamic function. So watch, I'm going to turn that on right here. So I'm just going to go to this really nasty part.
Screechy, noisy.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So just going to solo that until I can really find the really, really worst parts of the frequencies.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal.
Okay, so that's about where I really want to deal with it. But what I want to happen is I don't want the EQ on except for when it really kind of jumps up and peaks. So I turned on the dynamic EQ part of this. I'll show it on another dynamic, like a multiband compressor or something in a second. But so let me play this.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is
so
the
here I'm
off
bringing up
mic.
the ratio a
Here's
lot.
a real nasal. This is
pretty
the
fast.
off mic.
It's already
Here's
kinda
a
set,
real
right?
nasal.
So I'm going to lower the
This is
threshold
off mic.
until it does something.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So see, now it's really only doing anything when that frequency peaks really hard. Otherwise, it's pretty much leaving the signal alone. Let's see what it does on the other part here.
Noisy, nasally onboard laptop mic. Probably what people are going to be using for Skype. Noisy and nasally.
So see, you're kind of using it kind of like you would use a de-esser or a deplosiver or whatever. So it's not really going to mess things up, except for when it really gets bad. So here, I'll play it without it.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
And here's with it on.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So it's not super perfect, but you could go around finding all these peaky things and getting rid of them. You could duplicate. Here, let me show you what I would do with them. I'll just show on a multi-band compressor instead here. So here's Rex Comp and Reaper. Again, I don't think there's a VST3 version of this thing, but it's going to do the same kind of thing. We're going to look for that section.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So same thing here as the EQ. It's just going to be messing with this band. It's going to leave the other bands alone. And I'm going to set a decently high ratio. And I'm just going to have it clamped down right away. So the RMS is going to be at 0. It's going to be a peak detector. Again, really fast attack. You can make a slow release, whatever. And so let's turn this on and we'll start pulling the threshold down.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic.
So again, you could really fine tune this, and you could do this really fast. You can, if you're not having to explain it, you can actually pull this off pretty quick. I'm not sure what if there's any free VST3 multiband compressors or dynamic EQs right now, but I remember this Tone Boosters one was actually pretty cheap. I'm betting Melda probably has something. I think those are VST3, but of course the flagship of them all is which I don't have. There's the Fab Filter, the Fab Filter Pro MB. I mean, those guys have really done a good job on everything, but it's pretty pricey. But you see how this works. This multi-band dynamics really makes this easy. Again, so here's the Tone Boosters one again.
Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal. This is the off mic. Here's a real nasal.
And you know you could go and really fine tune that, but so anyway, hopefully this helps to give you an idea of how this works. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't keep up my end of things today. Sorry about that.